term of life without the possibility of parole.
The audio recordings were damaging to me, to my defense.
Prosecutors say 48-year-old Jay Witt will serve a mandatory 22 and a half years in prison.
And there was an outburst in the courtroom this morning as closing arguments were being heard in the triple murder trial of a member of the Hells Angel Motorcycle Club.
Is there anything that you would like to say, sir?
No.
You ever seen a biker stare down life in prison and smile? That's the Hells Angels in court. Where the law ruled, they were rebellion and violence on two wheels.
Fatal shooting of a Hells Angels bikie outside his mother's house in Sydney.
But when some of the most dangerous among them finally faced the very law they opposed, the room didn't get what it expected. Some stared down fate like it was an old friend. Others? They roared back with words that couldn't be printed in polite company. These are the most notorious Hells Angels facing life sentences. Joseph Lanchia. How does someone so young climb to the top of one of America's most feared outlaw clubs? Human life was just another card in the game. By his age, he'd already worn the crown as president of Rhode Island's Hells Angels chapter, a title that carried respect and a target big enough to draw blood. As a high-ranking member, Joseph's road was paved with violence and territorial clashes, a path that would land him behind bars in 2019. After a shooting outside a Hells Angels clubhouse in Providence, he went further, embroiling himself in a bloody strip club fight in 2020. The shooting wasn't random, it was the kind of calculated strike that came with the president patch. The strip club brawl, a choreographed show of force. When bullets tore the air outside his own clubhouse, Lanchia wasn't just protecting walls, he was defending the core of his power. Arrested on multiple charges, Joseph pled not guilty to assault with a dangerous weapon, illegal pistol possession, and assault to cause unconsciousness. 15 years at the adult correctional institutions, 5 to serve. For most, that's crushing. But when the judge read the sentence, Lanchia did something else. As cuffs closed on his wrists, he nodded to a brother and smiled, sending the message he wasn't broken and would wear his time like a badge. But Joseph's story didn't end with that courtroom grin. In June, he walked free after an early release. Prison had been a pause, just as he'd likely planned. The system tried, he endured, and while his violence was proven, another Hells Angel would prove far worse. Veobus. If Joseph represented violence and organized crime, then Veobus was the embodiment of evil as an identity.
See you all in hell, truly remember that. Every one of you, I'll see you in hell.
Born Roy Gafinski Jr., Caius changed his identity starting from his name in 2008 and went further by altering his looks to fit his image. He surgically transformed himself into humanity's darkest nightmares, with horn-like implants on his forehead, piercings, the number 666 tattooed on his forehead, teeth filings, and other body alterations. This was more than just body modification. It was a complete rejection of his humanity and a bid to match his internal darkness. A fact the world became aware of in 1999, when Caius and his girlfriend kidnapped and mutilated a 16-year-old girl in a motel room. The twisted couple slashed the teenager on her back with a razor blade and kissed as they licked up the girl's blood. Their victim would end up needing 32 stitches to close the wound. After his arrest, Caius was sentenced to 10 years for elevated aggravated assault, and reckless conduct, but only served 7.5.
Drama in Hampden County Superior Court this afternoon, 6 days after the jury got the case against Veobus.
But that earlier conviction should have been a warning. The brutality wasn't impulsive, it was ritualistic. The blood-licking detail reveals something beyond mere violence. It shows a man who'd found pleasure in causing pain. During the trial, Caius openly confessed to being a vampire and a Satanist before he was sentenced. When he was released early, society gave him a second chance, but he used it to orchestrate something infinitely worse. In 2011, Caius once again found himself on the bad side of the law by his involvement in the brutal torture and murder of 3 men, namely David Glasser, Edward Frampton, and Robert Chadwell. The 3 were abducted in Pittsfield, with their dismembered bodies later discovered on private property in Beckett. The methodical nature of the crimes involving the abduction, the dismemberment, and the delayed discovery speaks to a level of premeditation that chills the blood. These weren't heat-of-the-moment killings. They were executions carried out with surgical precision. For his part, Caius was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But it was Caius's reaction to his life sentence that truly revealed the depths of his depravity. When faced with spending the rest of his natural life behind bars, he didn't express remorse. Instead, he yelled, "I'll see you all in hell!" But if you think Caius had it worse, another Hell's Angel member capable of worse evil faced even worse punishment. Adam Lee Hall. He was just another Hell's Angel member until the day he rose to power and became synonymous with one of the most brutal triple murders in history. Adam Lee Hall held the position of Sergeant-at-Arms, a role that carried both respect and terrible responsibility within the outlaw motorcycle gang's hierarchy. But it was in August 2011 that his fate changed forever. By killing 3 men, Adam believed he was silencing potential witnesses who would testify against him. The victims, David Glasser, Edward Frampton, and Robert Chadwell, had made a fatal mistake. They knew too much. But Adam didn't just kill these men. Their bullet-riddled bodies were dismembered with a power saw in a failed attempt to conceal the crimes. The bodies were then buried in Beckett, Massachusetts, in what investigators would later describe as one of the most gruesome crime scenes they had ever encountered. For nearly 3 years, Hall maintained his innocence. He sat through countless hearings, watched evidence pile up against him, and listened as witnesses described the horrific details of his crimes. But on February 7, 2014, the man who had once commanded respect through violence and intimidation was reduced to a hunched figure. Adam was convicted of 3 counts each of murder, kidnapping, and witness intimidation for orchestrating the gruesome killings. The conviction carried an automatic sentence that would ensure Hall would never again walk free. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms for killing 3 men, then dismembering and burying the bodies. 3 lives taken, 3 life sentences to serve.
And this is not going to be anything like she had to go through.
But as shocking as Adam's tale was, there's another Hell's Angel member who took territorial war personally. Richard Dveries. What drives a 66-year-old man to orchestrate an ambush on a busy Nevada highway? Richard Dveries and a few of his fellow Hell's Angels club members were arrested on suspicion of multiple charges, including 6 counts of attempted murder, following what prosecutors would later describe as a calculated act of violence that shattered the illusion of honor among thieves. Memorial Day weekend 2022 should have been about remembrance and reflection. Instead, on a stretch of Henderson Freeway, it became a stage for unprecedented brutality. 2 were hospitalized in critical condition after Richard and his fellow Hell's Angels allegedly waited on a Henderson freeway to shoot at members of another biker group. The victims weren't random civilians caught in crossfire. They were members of the rival Veobus motorcycle club, targeted with the precision of military operatives. But what was the reason for such a display of bloody violence? It was nothing more than a fight for dominance and a typical display of Hell's Angels violence. Following the crime, Richard and his crew were arrested and charged in court. If convicted of attempted murder with a weapon, each could face up to 40 years in prison. But when Dveries appeared in court, observers noted something unsettling about his demeanor. Here was a man who had allegedly orchestrated an ambush that left 7 people wounded, yet he carried himself with the stoic resolve of someone who believed his actions were justified. Prosecutors filed a superseding indictment, adding gang enhancements to the majority of charges against Richard, escalating what was already a life-altering case into something far more severe. And while the fight for territory and power is mostly outward, a Hell's Angels member brought the fight home to one of his own. Jonathan Nelson. If Richard Dveries represented the chaos of interclub warfare, Jonathan John Nelson embodied something far more sinister, the willingness to destroy one's own family. Jonathan, along with 2 other Hell's Angels members, faced the law in a federal court in San Francisco when they violated the most sacred principle of brotherhood, murdering one of their own. The victim, Joel Silva, was a Hell's Angels Sonoma Club member who was lured to Fresno, shot in the head, and illegally cremated to cover up the crime. But Joel wasn't just another member. He was family in the truest sense that the club understood it. Yet John, a 46-year-old from Santa Rosa, participated in what prosecutors described as an execution masked as brotherhood. The mechanics of Silva's murder reveal the chilling calculation behind the act. Silva was lured to what he believed was a routine club meeting, unaware that his brothers had already decided his fate. The betrayal wasn't spontaneous. It was methodical, planned, and executed with the cold efficiency that would later shock even seasoned federal prosecutors. But when the guilty verdict was read in June 2022, courtroom observers watched John's face for any crack in his composure. Convicted in a 9-week jury trial of murder in the course of racketeering, which carries a mandatory sentence of life without parole, John was sentenced to life with no parole, no second chances, and no possibility of redemption.
By the verdict of being guilty, it's over. The healing process can begin.
For a man who had lived by the club's code, the irony was shocking. He would die in prison, not for fighting enemies, but for murdering family. The interesting part, John wasn't alone in this descent into darkness. His co-conspirator and another Hells Angels member had walked an even more treacherous path to the same fate. Brian Wayne Went. What happens when the very person sworn to protect the Brotherhood becomes its destroyer? Brian Wayne Went didn't just participate in Joel Silva's murder, his betrayal made it worse. The 45-year-old club president held a position of ultimate authority and trust. Members looked to him for guidance, protection, and leadership. Instead, he led them into the darkness of fratricide. When Brian sanctioned Silva's murder, he wasn't just ordering an execution, he was altering the nature of what it meant to be a brother in the club. But in the world of Hells Angels, the president's word is law, and thus the weight of Brian's betrayal cannot be understated. When Silva was lured to the Fresno clubhouse, it was Brian who delivered the killing blow with a shot to the back of Silva's head. After the murder, the body was delivered to a local crematory and burned. Shortly after, Brian, along with his accomplices, were arrested and charged with murder. But the death of Silva was the least of Brian's problems. Along with a murder charge, Brian and his team faced other charges that included assaults, extortion, drug trafficking, robbery, and witness intimidation. During his sentence hearing, the courtroom drama reached a crescendo. Here was someone who had commanded respect, fear, and loyalty from dozens of hardened criminals, now reduced to a defendant awaiting the inevitable pronouncement of life without parole. And when the sentence was finally delivered, Brian's reaction was telling, not of rage or despair, but a kind of resigned acceptance that spoke to something broken within the man. Speaking of broken men, the third Hells Angel member in Silva's murder was so far gone, his reaction was cold. Russell Taylor Ott. He spent decades living by one simple rule, and that was loyalty above all else. But the same rule altered his life forever. Known in the Brotherhood as Rusty, 69 years old, Russell Taylor Ott was the grizzled veteran of the Sonoma County Hells Angels chapter. But when he stood before the court in 2024, waiting for the verdict, he never would have believed what he heard. What brought Rusty to this moment wasn't a rivalry with law enforcement or a territorial dispute with another club. It was the murder of one of their own members, Joel Silva. And while the evidence against Ott painted a picture of calculated brutality, federal prosecutors argued that he hadn't just participated in murder, he had helped orchestrate it as part of a broader racketeering conspiracy that included drug trafficking, witness intimidation, and violence designed to maintain the club's iron grip on their territory. Although Rusty had merely driven Silva to his death place, he was part of the plan to eliminate him from the beginning. According to accounts, each of the conspirators agreed that Silva should be killed, and they played a part to make that happen. For his own role, Rusty was sentenced to life without parole. When his sentence was announced, Rusty didn't flinch, curse the system, or proclaim his innocence. Instead, according to witnesses present, he simply nodded once, a gesture that spoke volumes about a man who had accepted that his loyalty to the club would cost him everything. But just like another Hells Angels member, Rusty's reaction was a final performance of a man who dared not show weakness. Thomas Heath. Some cases define a criminal organization's reach into local communities, and Thomas Heath's story showed how deeply the Hells Angels embedded themselves into the fabric of American life. At 64 years old, Thomas faced Ventura County Superior Court Judge David Hirsch for charges that struck at the heart of what made organized crime so insidious: witness intimidation and the systematic corruption of justice. Thomas's case was different from the federal racketeering prosecutions that had dominated headlines. This was about power exercised at the street level, where the Hells Angels' reputation for violence could silence witnesses and derail investigations before they ever reached a courtroom. The charges against Heath centered on his efforts to prevent witnesses from cooperating with law enforcement, a crime that prosecutors argued went to the very foundation of the justice system. But what made Heath's case particularly significant was its timing and context. As federal investigators were dismantling Hells Angels chapters across the country through massive racketeering cases, Thomas's prosecution represented the local impact of the organization's criminal activities. This was more than just international drug trafficking or complex financial crimes. It was about a community held hostage by fear. When his verdict of 30 years to life was announced, Thomas's reaction surprised everyone. Unlike younger members who might still harbor hopes of appeals or reduced sentences, Heath understood that at his age, this was effectively a death sentence. Court observers noted that his response seemed to reflect not just acceptance of his fate, but a kind of resigned pride in having never broken the club's code of silence. Marius Lazar. While he built a criminal empire as a Hells Angels member, Marius Lazar failed to see how it would lead him to a courtroom. Marius, The 51-year-old founder of the Romanian Hells Angels chapter had transformed a local motorcycle club into an international criminal organization that stretched from the streets of Bucharest to the ports of South America. To the outside world, it was a mere motorcycle club, but this was international terrorism disguised as brotherhood. The scope of Marius's operation was staggering. Federal investigators had uncovered evidence of a sophisticated network designed to smuggle hundreds of kilograms of cocaine from South America through Romania and into the United States. But what made Marius's case particularly chilling was the calculated nature of his violence. He hadn't just built a drug empire, he had created a murder-for-hire operation that targeted anyone who threatened his organization's interests. In January 2025, Marius stood before the court, facing charges including conspiracy to import massive quantities of cocaine, money laundering, arms trafficking, and perhaps most shocking of all, plotting to murder rival motorcycle club members and even U.S. law enforcement officers. Here, surrounded by federal marshals and facing a mountain of evidence that included recorded conversations and testimony from undercover agents, was a man who had once commanded respect through fear. When the judge handed down the 300-month federal prison sentence, or 25 years behind bars, Marius's reaction was reported to be one of barely controlled rage. Unlike the stoic acceptance displayed by other Hells Angels facing similar fates, Marius reportedly struggled with the reality that his international empire had crumbled. Raymon Folks. He didn't just wear the Hells Angels patch, he embraced everything the club represented, and that included the worst of humanity. As president of the Sonoma County chapter, Raymond "Ray" Folks commanded respect through a simple philosophy: submission through brutality. He got respect by beating people, including other Hells Angels, down into submission. He orchestrated multi-hour beatings of expelled members, sexually assaulted their wives while the torture continued, then threatened them into silence. But it wasn't just enemies who feared Ray. His own brotherhood lived under the constant threat of his wrath. But like most criminals, his luck ran out in the worst way in 2023 with charges of racketeering against him. The racketeering charges encompassed robbery, drug dealing, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice, a criminal resume spanning decades. When the verdicts came down in May 2023, after a grueling 2-month trial, Ray was found guilty and sentenced to 70 months in prison, along with a fine of $1 million in restitution. The end was near. He finally faced the collapse of everything he'd built. The courtroom observers searched Ray's face for any crack in his armor, any sign that the weight of his sentence had penetrated the hardened exterior. Yet true to form, the man who had terrorized Northern California for decades gave them nothing. No outburst, no plea for mercy, no visible emotion at all. And just like Ray, his accomplice and fellow Hells Angel member faced the same fate. Christopher Renieri. He was president of the Salem, Massachusetts chapter of Hells Angels, and he represented a different breed of Hells Angel, the calculating enforcer who turned murder into a business proposition. Christopher Raymond Renieri brought East Coast efficiency to West Coast violence. Where Ray ruled through emotional brutality, Raymond operated with cold precision. The murder conspiracy that would ultimately destroy him began with a simple business dispute that escalated into a death sentence. Federal investigators revealed how Raymond played a part in the assassination of rival gang member Silva, painting him as the architect of violence, a man who could order death with the same casual demeanor others might use to order coffee. According to reports, Silva had threatened a fellow club member, one who was close to Raymond, and that signed his death warrant. Standing alongside Ray in a federal courtroom, Raymond faced the same devastating charges, but unlike Raymond had murder attached to his charges. While his colleague Ray had an explosive reputation, Raymond had built his career on staying in the shadows, letting others take the spotlight while he pulled the strings. Even his nickname suggested his preference for operating behind the scenes, watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Raymond was convicted of involvement in a murder conspiracy and racketeering, and he faced a maximum sentence of life in prison without parole, charges that would effectively end his life outside prison walls. Yet Raymond lived up to his reputation for emotional detachment. No theatrical outbursts, no desperate last-minute pleas.
And I want to be clear here, this was an exhausting trial. It was very emotionally taxing, especially...
But no matter how stoic Raymond appeared to be, the transition from the courthouse to the cell would be different for Raymond. Maurice Boucher. Unlike other Hell's Angels who faced their fate with stoic silence, Maurice Boucher's response to his ultimate judgment revealed a man completely unbroken by the justice system's attempts to contain him. The 48-year-old Quebec Hell's Angels leader who turned criminal enterprise into an art form grinned as the verdict was read out, a smile that would haunt those present in the Montreal courtroom for years to come. But how did he go from a man of power to one who faced a life in prison? In 1997, Maurice ordered the killings of prison guards Diane Levine and Pierre Rondeau in a plot to destabilize the justice system and declare war on the very foundations of civil order. These prison guards had been executed not for personal vendettas, but as symbols of everything Maurice opposed. In 2002, Maurice finally faced the law for his role in the deaths of 2 workers of the law. Here was a man facing life imprisonment for masterminding the executions of 2 prison guards, and his reaction was not rage, fear, or desperation, but apparent satisfaction. He was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and was to serve 3 consecutive life sentences. Yet even from behind bars, Maurice's story was far from over. Besides the attempts on his life, he remained heavily involved in crime. He pleaded guilty to conspiring to murder a high-ranking mafia member while both men were behind bars, proving that prison walls couldn't contain his appetite for violence. Even facing a life sentence, he continued plotting murders from his cell, treating incarceration as merely a change of venue rather than a limitation on his activities. While in prison, Maurice succumbed to throat cancer and passed away on July 10, 2022. His end, a contrast to the life of violence he lived. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.